skills. And there was an interesting study done about a year ago where they took questions from patients and they had doctors answer those questions, and then they had AI answer those questions. And then they had independent health experts rate the quality of the answers in terms of two different criteria. One is how clinically accurate was the answer, and then how empathetic was the answer.
I know
one of the things was the AI answers were 2x more accurate than the doctor's answers. Yeah. But really surprisingly, the AI answers were 7 times more empathetic than the doctor's answers.
Think most people are bad at the people stuff. Welcome back. This is the season finale of season 2 of Unsolicited Feedback. I spent a lot of time thinking about how best to wrap this season, and I thought there was no better way than to get together all of the people that have helped me co-host the show over the course of the season. We brought Brian Balfour, Ravi Mehta, and Joff Redfern all to the table this week for a bigger episode where we dive in to all of the things that we each found the most interesting over the course of the season and over the course of the first half of 2024. First, we start off with a little bit of a normal unsolicited feedback riff, talk a little bit about hardware products, the emerging hardware products in the AI space, but also just physical products and how some physical products can be luxury versus just premium, and what the differences are between luxury products and premium products, and why we don't see luxury products in software. But then we dive in to the real meat of the episode. The first part of our deep dive on previous topics is on the concept of the revolution in unstructured data. We ended up talking about this across a number of different episodes with Behzad Sirjani, with Ravi Mehta, and also with Ben Kuss, the CTO of Box. And so we dive deep on where we think some opportunities still exist and what we're excited about as LLMs change how well we can dive in to previously hard to understand unstructured data. The second part of our discussion is on the effects of AI on the role of the product manager. This has been a really hot topic for many different people, and we riff on some posts from some other authors, as well as our own thoughts on where we think the PM job will change the most versus stay the same as AI products make the job easier in a bunch of different places. We hope you enjoy this episode. We'll dive right in. This podcast wouldn't be possible without the fine folks at Reforge, so I wanted to spend a few minutes just talking about a few things that they have coming that you should check out. First, on the last episode, we talked about the Reforge extension, which you can download for free. It's an AI extension that helps you solve product problems with the help of experts. It is totally free, and you can check it out at reforge.com/extension. Next, I am excited for the Ref AI Festival, a Reforge festival, one-day festival on June 25th. Amongst a bunch of different sessions with great leaders, we'll be doing a live taping of this podcast with Andrew Chen, and I am super excited to talk to him about many different topics. If you'd like, check out our episode with Andrew from season 1. Last, Reforge is launching a new course built by Rupa Chaturvedi and Polly Allen, who are both renowned industry experts in generative AI from teams like Amazon's Alexa, Google, and Uber. This is a 3-week program about how to get from idea to MVP on Gen AI products, and will be starting on June 14th. Check it out at reforge.com/courses. Right on, Brian.
We were talking about your Vora wardrobe when you were here.
Vuori wardrobe? Yeah.
Vuori.
Yeah, high recommend. So, nothing but.
NPS off the charts for you?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I've definitely referred quite a bit of business to them. So, yeah, I'm definitely a 10 out of 10. So, nice. But I also like simplicity. I also like simplicity. That doesn't roll with everybody.
Yeah, you're an adherent to the Jobs/Zuckerberg, wear the same thing every day kind of style of dress, correct?
Kind of, yeah. I will admit, though, okay, this is a little bit weird maybe, but all right. So I joined a new gym recently, and the clientele of this gym is very different. It's like
Marin County, baby.
my old gym was definitely a younger crowd. It was a much cheaper gym, and which is probably why. And this new gym is definitely an older, like Mill Valley-esque type crowd. And something that I've noticed from switching from gym to gym is that in the new gym, I'm seeing a lot of folks also wearing Biore, which I didn't in the old gym, and it hit me. It really made it like, oh man, I'm an old man. And I'm going through that, like early 40s, midlife crisis at the moment.
Well, welcome to the crowd.
Yeah, wanting to be on the younger side of things. And so now I'm like, oh man, do I need to go back to my old gym and pick up the young vibes now? So anyways, yeah.
You should just embrace it, Brian. You should just embrace it.
I know.
I was just saying the way I got it, I just bought a bunch of Viore stuff myself for free ad here for them because it's comfy and it fits really well for me at least. And I liked it, but I didn't know it was possible to spend that kind of money on things you sweat in. Like the culture of workout gear has moved so much over the past decade from wear the grossest thing you have and it doesn't matter to look good when you show up at the gym. And I've definitely tried to fit in more, in that direction. I want it to be comfy, but I also don't want to look like a dweeb.
Tank tops are out.
Tank tops are always out for me, but yes.
It's funny because in the new gym, there's signs all over the place that's like no recording. Yes. There's, but they make that very, very clear. So,
yeah. I mean, in general, I've been so fascinated by this, especially in hard goods products like clothes and other things, that there is always an upper market that you didn't know existed until somebody releases a product in it. Water bottles are my favorite example of this. That a water bottle used to be a cheap piece of commodity junk that was plastic. And then someone came out with a nice water bottle, like a hydro flask. And you're like, wow, I can spend $30 on a water bottle. And then the next thing, or an Nalgene. And then the next thing came out, and it was a Yeti. And the Yeti was a $60 water bottle.
This reminds me of Yeti.
And now there's a Stanley, and it's the same in coolers, and it's the same in workout clothes. It's the same in ski gear too. You've seen the upper end of what someone will pay for a ski jacket has gone from $200-$300 to $1,000 or $600-$700. And it's always fascinating that in certain markets, there's always a doubly priced thing as long as you nail the right things, like the combo of fashion and unnecessary durability. How many people need a Yeti cooler to keep ice cold for 6 days? Zero. But the fact that it doesn't means that you can charge 4 times as much for it. So I'm always fascinated by those categories. I'm always wondering what the next one will be.
It definitely lifts the game in the whole category. I was looking at a Yeti cooler in the hardware store this past weekend, and I saw the Igloo coolers, and the Igloo coolers used to be just crap. And they've elevated their game because of Yeti, and they knock off a bunch of those feature sets. The build quality looks better. It's, a fraction of the cost of the Yeti. So those bar setters help make the world better.
Yeah. Does this happen in software? Is it possible to charge twice as much for the same product just because of a few little is there a combo of fashion?
No, I thought you were going to go on the bar setting piece of it, because remember in the early days of mobile, when Apple came out, and first of all the first apps were from Apple, and then they were the soup Nazis when it came to you submitted your app, and they gave you a whole laundry list of stuff that was non-compliant that you had to fix before you could release it in the App Store. So it was that initial way of saying, hey, Android, Google Play Store, you can do whatever you want, but we're going to make sure that this is Yeti style apps.
Yeah.
But to your question, can you pay twice as much for essentially the same thing? I mean, on the hardware side, I suppose you see that between iOS and Android. I mean, they have their build qualities on a number of take a high-end Samsung phone and the Apple iPhone, the build quality is probably fairly comparable and the price point is different. But on the software side, that's a good question.
Categories tend to hover. I mean, Slack and HipChat was $2 a month. Slack's $8 when it first released. So maybe that's, or 6 or 7. So that's the best I can think of.
The high end in all goods is equally about signaling as it is about quality.
Right.
Right. having the hydro flask is cool for teenagers, right? It's just like the branding element.
Not anymore, Brian.
Yeah, well, okay, whatever it is. But like I said, I'm early 40s. I'm old. I'm behind things. All right, like I'm coming to a realization around this, and so I think you definitely see it in some places like online education, but that's not pure software, right? Where signaling matters, and I just think like in software, it's like, do you care if you're a HubSpot CRM user versus Pipedrive? Like, is that sending a status signal of any sort? Like, maybe it's like cool for a little bit, but it doesn't feel durable in most software adoption.
The one example I can think of for luxury software is Superhuman, right? Their price point is a lot higher than other email clients. They've got the concierge onboarding. They've designed the product for a certain set of people that really value their time. And I think the signaling was in the early days. Like if you had Superhuman and you were able to invite people to it, that was part of the social signaling around it. But that's the only one I could think of that's a really good example of high-end software that sort of captures some of the elements of high-end products in other markets.
Yeah, I think some work stuff has this quality early on, at least. I think for a while we heard messages at Slack that like there were people who didn't want to work at companies who didn't use it. For instance, right? Like they're like, oh, I wouldn't want to work somewhere that doesn't use Slack. So there's like a cool factor to it. Certainly you're seeing this with Linear. I think that's a growing thing that I don't know where their pricing falls versus equivalent products, but certainly it has the feel of being like hand designed for this specific use case and is, I think, part of their success, which is pretty interesting. I feel like Figma had it for a while, but now it's sort of the de facto standard for design stuff. So I think there are some qualities.
Yeah, it's interesting as you say it. I'm thinking to myself, part of it is the product, but the other part of it is really the community that gets built around the products. So the early Figma community was amazing. The Linear has a good community around it. And where that community actually takes place is interesting too, because sometimes we see it in Slack, sometimes we see it in Discord, sometimes we see it on Reddit. But there is definitely a cool, there's a cool kid factor.
Yeah, so signaling, I think that's an interesting one, Brian, is that physical goods can do this because you carry them around. They have like that casual, what do we call it? Casual contact virality to them, right? Like, I have whatever water bottle I have. It's got a big logo on the outside of it, right? For a reason. It has a very specific design. It's harder to do that with software, especially software that's, B2B SaaS. But Superhuman's a good example. But
it just goes against the goals of most software companies too, right? Like one of the key tenets of luxury marketing strategy is the ratio you optimize for is you want the number of people that have acquired your product to the number of people who know your product to be as low as possible, right? So whereas like in Figma and like software and stuff, that goes directly against the venture funding, right? Like you are looking for the most adoption possible. I just don't think it plays out in how software companies are kind of funded and all those pieces. So
yeah, and the Hermes and LVMH episodes of Acquired, they talk about, I think
that's
they
what
call
I'm
it
about,
luxury versus high end
versus premium,
or versus premium. And premium is it actually is a better product. So an Apple Watch is premium, or an iPhone
you're getting higher willingness to pay because of the quality.
Right.
Yeah.
But luxury is about, I don't remember exactly how they describe it, but about something else like that. I like that ratio as a definer of it. It's something to be coveted or wanted or desired that is hard to get. And you're paying for the name on some level. You're paying for the prestige. And I don't think even Apple products don't quite have that, right? They have strong brand, but they are high end. They're not, it's the same product with a different name on it and it's worth 10 times as much. It has the same utility.
Yeah. Do you remember when the Apple Watch first came out? Maybe it was not version 1, but version 2, and they had the gold version of it.
Yeah.
And it was like 10x the amount of money, like literally no different features. It was just 10x the amount.
And it didn't work.
Yeah, it was the funniest thing though, because it really is. I mean, you see that a lot in fashion, right? With watches. Margot had a friend of hers who was in marketing at Fountain Pen, And it's like, okay, I have a big pen and I have a fountain pen. And like the delta, this thing's like less than $1. This thing's $100. And it's like, let's go ahead and write with the two. And it does have a different feel, but when you're looking at the ink and how it's laid on the piece of paper, there's not a whole lot difference. Like if you're a recipient of a note that I hand wrote you, you're not looking at that going, Jesus, Redfern must have used a fountain pen on this letter. This thing is gorgeous.
I do that, Joff, just to let you know. So I like those handwritten notes. I want those handwritten notes from you.
I know. All those handwritten notes that I've sent over snail mail to you, Brian. I hope you're keeping them.
I do. I have them saved in my drawer and everything. Side note, the book called Luxury Strategy is a fascinating book. It's full of one of my favorite questions asked is like, most people think X, but you actually think it's Y. And it's just like full of those types of nuggets. It's a fascinating read that I picked up after the LVMH episode from Acquired. So,
do you remember one of those X's and Y's? Now I'm curious.
Yeah, well, the one was the one that I just mentioned about. So one of them is like, most people think luxury is around quality. It's like, it's not. Like, that's premium. Luxury is about signaling and other things. The other one was about like that ratio that I described. There's a bunch in there around pricing. There's a bunch in there around making it harder to get the product, not easier to get the product, and in different ways to like employ it. Yeah. There's a lot in there also about just like the actual creative and the messaging. Like none of the luxury products talk about the quality or the features of the product. That's implied, right? It's implied through the messaging of using things like, the lifestyle. Like think about like a luxury watch ad. You've got somebody on a freaking yacht laid out in the sun with models around, and they don't even say anything about the watch. It's just, he's just sitting there like with the watch, right? If you pick it up, they have like something called like 20 tenets of luxury marketing or something like that. You can just blow through those in like 2 hours, and that's where most of it is.
It sounds like one of those books that someone would give to their fellow podcast hosts as a gift.
Imagine that. Okay.
Yeah.
What a fascinating statement to make while you're here. And what we've done is brought all of the co-hosts of our Unsolicited Feedback season here together. So each of you have teamed up with me at different points across the season. And so what I thought we could do, beyond just riff about Brian's fancy Yeti mug he's drinking out of right now and luxury software, is sort of talk about some of the themes that we've covered over the course of the season that have stuck out or stuck with you the most over the course of the past couple of months. There have been a bunch of different things that we end up talking about over and over and over again, no matter what products or new news we're talking about on the show. And I thought that was interesting and started putting some together. So I figured we'd jump through some of those. The one that's really stuck with me, obviously, is we've talked a ton about AI stuff. But the piece of the puzzle that I've found the most interesting, that has just come up time and time again with a variety of different hosts. Ravi, we talked about it with Behzad Sarjani. I ended up talking about it with Ben Cuss, the CTO of Box, is, and I think Joff, you and I spent some time on this as well, is the idea of what Ben is calling a revolution in unstructured data. This seems like one of the key themes of what's coming out. So on its surface, in AI, we talk about it as like chatbots and copilots and agents and all this other stuff. But what I find more interesting is the underlying, mechanism, which is that LLMs make previously difficult to analyze, think about, reason about, or structure data, things like documents or text or video or user feedback, can bring a lot of structure to that and allow you to interact with it like you would structured data, things that we think of as being normally in databases, tags, numbers, events, analytics, those kinds of things. And so that has been on my mind a lot as an interesting topic. And I'm curious if this has stuck with y'all as well.
I'm just going to add one thing to your preamble. As you were saying it, I was thinking to myself, literally about 80% of the world's data is unstructured. And 20% of it is structured. So when you think about it through that lens, you're thinking to yourself, holy crap, 80% of the stuff that was out there was essentially blind to us, or someone had to go in there and try to make sense of it. I remember way back in the day when Yahoo bought Flickr. One of the great things about Flickr is that it had a tagging system and it had a folksonomy to it. So the thing about all of these billions of photos that were showing up in Flickr, which if you don't know what Flickr is, it was, imagine Instagram for the web. You know, it was like the precursor to Instagram. And because you could have a tag on it, you actually could find stuff that was interesting to you. And I remember there was the London bombings, and all of a sudden, people on Flickr who were there at the event were tagging London bombings. And something like 8 minutes before the press had shown up to capture the catastrophe, there were actually things on Flickr where people like, I'm here on the scene and this is what it was. And you were able to draw attention to it. And that was such a powerful concept because essentially you had crowdsourced putting structure on top of unstructured data. But now with AI, you don't even need like millions of people to be tagging things. You've got a system, a reasoning system that is going to, you know, help you sense make something. That is it's kind of like a crazy concept.
Yeah.
When you think about it.
I think you mentioned like 80% is unstructured. I think from a company's perspective, the amount of unstructured data they are gathering is also increasing at a pretty accelerating rate. So if you just think about like all the tools like Gong and all the Zoom recorders now and all that kind of stuff, in addition to all of the qualitative data that your customers are creating out there, like about you on social media and stuff, that amount is like increasing pretty substantially. About a year ago, maybe a little bit more than a year ago, I kind of looked at an idea that was, I don't know, I sort of referred to it as like the snowflake for qualitative information. It was like, how do you capture all of this information in a processable way? And then, of course, the whole idea is that LLMs become like almost like a querying language as like SQL is to structured data. Yep. And there are some companies playing in that space, but I haven't seen anybody feel like they nailed it out of the park yet. I still think there's an opportunity there because of the increasing amount of that we're capturing. It creates problems for different roles, whether that's, you know, product managers trying to process all of this information, to customer success, to support. So it's definitely interesting to see where this will go.
I was just going to say what I think is interesting about this is right now the interaction is ask my data questions in, you know, plain text, Copilot-y, chatbot kind of way. But I think as I talked to Ben about it, he said, you know, another opportunity that is really interesting is to create this metadata like you're describing, Joff, with tags on the fly. So you can still, there's a lot of value in structured querying, structured question asking. So if you can put the structure on top of the unstructured data, use traditional Snowflake style analytics to get at it, and then still have the on the fly thing, I think you get the best of both worlds. And I'm curious to see how that starts to extend. And so like right now, we do a lot of companies use like vectors, vectorization, vector databases, these kinds of things to do this kind of stuff. But maybe there's more to it than that is what I'm interested in seeing as we move forward in all of this. And as a result of those conversations, like companies who do this have reached out to us and sort of said like, hey, here's my take on it. Here's my take on it.
Let me just riff on this. Right, I just had an idea as you were like talking about it. Right, like if you can get all that information into the right place in a processable way, you can basically essentially write prompts like almost as like recurring prompts or cron jobs, right, for different, you know, jobs to be done inside the organization, right? So like PRD, like what if you just had this thing every single week, take all the new information and just generate 10 different possible PRDs, right, for new things you could do off of the information. And then you can have somebody just look at any of them and see if there's any like interest. I think you could do that for a lot of different tasks within the organization versus it's the push versus pull type of activity. So
I think there's a lot here. I've actually been playing with some of this stuff on my own. And I think the critical thing that LLMs change is qual data used to be a black box. And so you'd have your quant data, you'd have your qual data, and you have to take a completely different approach to analyzing qual data versus quant data. And the best path for trying to do that in the past was some sort of like tagging or structuring type of activity where you paid people to go in, look at the data and tag a certain part of it, sample it, and then do your analysis on it. I played around with doing like that analysis automatically with LLMs, and you can cluster data together. So you can look at 10,000 survey responses and cluster together the language and identify where are there clusters of people talking about the same thing, and then use those clusters as a way to tag the data. And then you could start to look at things that are quantitative, like an NPS score or retention actually tied to a particular cluster of language that you're seeing around responses from users. You could also do some really interesting feature extraction. So you can look at qualitative responses that are coming in and extract, was this person upset or not? Did they mention a product or not? Did they mention their contact information? All of this would have been impossible to do a few years ago. And now it's pretty straightforward using LLMs to create those feature extraction prompts, create a whole new set of quantitative data based on the qualitative data, and be able to kind of open up that black box of qual data and start to look at that data in a much more analytical way. And I think a lot of the companies that are in this space right now are thinking about it in terms of how do we eliminate the human from this process entirely? So given a stream of data like survey responses, go ahead and analyze those and come up with a report. I think there's a really interesting middle ground here where we say it's not a matter of taking the human out entirely. It's really a matter of giving the human superpowered tools to be able to analyze both qual data and quant data using LLMs.
You keep the taste making. You just make the taste making more efficient.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a really good delineation, the qual and the quant stuff, because we've been working so hard on the quant side, like grinding away on the BI tools and the Snowflake and Databricks databases and getting all that stuff in order. I would say the whole lean product movement as well, the A/B experimentation. So you literally have a decade and a half worth of fine tuning on the quant systems, and the qual systems have been like they're essentially in the dark ages still, or maybe the Bronze Age. And I remember that both at Atlassian and at LinkedIn, when our research group went through all the different channels where we get feedback from a qual perspective, that would be surveying, it would be conferences, gong calls, things like that. There were literally over 100 channels. So in each of those organizations, we tried to build something that would pull in all 100 of the channels, and then you try to sense make from that. The issue is exactly what y'all said is, well, great, now some poor soul needs to go in there and try to do sentiment analysis, like hand rolling it and pulling it down. And that's either an APM or someone in the marketing organization or research organization. It's wildly inefficient. I'll tell you something that blew my mind. So I'm out at Carnegie Mellon University. This was 3 weeks ago. I'm talking to a professor in one of the graduate schools there. His background was marketing. And, we were going through some of these product issues. And I'm like, well, you have to sample the audience, or you have to A/B test something with an audience. Then you run into an issue that the audience may not be big enough to have statistical significance and things like that. And he's like, oh, well, it's fascinating because I just wrote a paper that you could create a synthetic audience with AI, and you actually don't need to run your A/B test. You can run it against a synthetic audience of your user base. And I was like, wait, that actually might work. That would be a crazy concept. And you kind of see this on the LLM side, right? Where they're running out of real data. So they're starting to create synthetic data. Like on the coding side, you'll see this. Some of the large foundational models are synthetically creating code to put in to continue to train the models. And you're like, oh man, synthetic audiences, mark my word, they're going to be huge.
Yeah, so you basically run your new feature through a simulation before releasing. Yeah, that makes sense.
Or marketing messaging, brand messaging, et cetera. It's interesting.
Before we move on, let me connect this to a different. I think we were going to say this topic for later, but I think it's relevant. Let's
segue.
which is, let me say something and then I'm interested to get all of your thoughts. So I think a while back, Lenny Rachitsky wrote an article about how AI might impact product management. And one of the things that he takes kind of an opinion on is that rather than impacting kind of some of the quote unquote lower level tasks like communication and coordination, it's going to have the most impact on the higher level tasks like product strategy and stuff, for a lot of the same reasons that kind of we're all talking about here today, which is AI is really good at bringing a bunch of unstructured data into a place and starting to make insights about it. But the thing that doesn't resonate with me about that opinion is that I think some of the best product strategy decisions and best product people I have worked with are really good at picking out the counterintuitive things to bet with. And that is something I have not seen AI be good at. Like AI is pretty good at picking out the patterns, like the quote unquote common stuff. But I think a lot of things like product strategy and product vision is about people who come to the table with a counterintuitive idea and manifestation of something that, you know, a lot of people know about or can't see themselves yet, and like bring it to life. And so I like that opinion never really resonated with me when I read it. I think what we're talking about here is maybe it makes some of the underlying tasks more efficient in surfacing, but ultimately at the end of the day, the thing that makes or breaks things like strategy and vision, those higher level tasks, is the taste making, right? And there's just, I don't know, like my thought is that is not going to be impacted. But Ravi, I'm interested. You sounds like you're playing around with this stuff, so I'm interested if you have a different take.
I have the same take as you. I think an interesting example is to look at companies that are really A/B experimentation oriented versus companies that are really vision oriented. A classic example is Booking.com versus Airbnb. The Booking.com site today is the accumulation of years and years worth of A/B testing and stacking on the A/B tests that worked, getting rid of the ones that didn't. And so it's a highly optimized product. They can bid more for travel traffic than pretty much anyone on Google. And it works well and people trust it. But nothing about them was going to get them to the insight that accommodations were going to fundamentally change because of the sharing economy. Because instead of relying only on the supply from hotels, you could actually create a completely new set of supply. And that's an interesting thing where I think AI would have a very hard time figuring out the top level strategy that would get you to that conclusion. And you know, the rate at which Airbnb grew relative to Booking was much faster. And now I haven't looked at the market caps lately, but I think it's got a higher market cap. And so, you know, that's an example of where I think AI would have a really hard time. There's intermediary things around like how do you design a feature or how do you like test a feature with a synthetic audience where I think AI can play a really interesting role. How do you automatically generate a PRD, which automatically translates into an experiment? But I think all of that needs exactly what you said, Brian, the taste of someone to say, this is information that can help inform which things we need to ship, which things are aligned with our strategy, and which things are not in alignment with our strategy.
Yeah, I think there was a lot of similar worldview around when growth, experimentation, A/B testing, and broad scale became more prevalent in the, you know, let's call it aughts, late aughts, like 06 through, 2014 or whatever, where the idea was like, oh, well, we can just have a optimizer A/B test our homepage automatically and find the perfect combination that like has the highest conversion. It'll just chase numbers. And that just like turned out not to be true. Right. And it turns out not to be true for lots of different reasons. Like one, most people don't have the scale to experiment at that fast of speed and scale. Two, as we all know, as product practitioners, the answers are noisy. There's always unintended side effects to different kinds of changes, and things get stuck in local maxima. So ultimately, even great structured data, analytical product people have to use a lot of taste in order to find and discover new approaches. And second, people are not the same. The inputs are not the same. The people I'm testing on in January of 2021 are very different than the people I'm testing in January of 2024. So the idea that I can just get the perfect homepage that's perfectly optimized is just not true. So I think the idea that this will all be automated is maybe I'm just not a big enough thinker. Maybe I'm not like AI enough here, but I agree with you. I think things like writing specs will be deeply impacted versus I think, in the article he talked about it like, somewhat impacted. And maybe writing the product strategy as a result of the pillars I've already set out will be easier. But I don't think the real work, which isn't writing the doc, the real work is figuring out what to do, will still be deeply important.
I think it's important. You have to kind of establish what is the role of the PM. And then you have to say, these are the 3 or 4 buckets of work that they're doing. And then I'm sure Lenny did this in his article, and then kind of say, okay, which ones of those are we going to use AI for first? So in my mind, there's kind of 2 ways to think about this. Like I've always said that the product role, you have to be a great product, like visionary, and build like a product that people love. And your success metric is NPS. And then you also have to be able to build a great business where the caliber of the business is going to be measured by ARR, year-over-year growth rate. So it's like at one lens, at the highest level, you're like, hey, are you a tastemaker? Build great products. And are you a good general manager? I think the general management piece of product management lends itself quite well for AI, because in that bucket, you're doing your A/B testing, you're doing modeling, like how much is this worth? How much will this new feature be worth? How much will this new product line be worth? You're doing forecasting and things like that. I think it lends itself well to AI. So that's like one model you could use. I think maybe the more interesting model is when you think about what a product manager does, it's like 3 things, right? Like they do strategy, they do prioritization. In fact, Fareed, you'll remember because we talked to Adam Nash, and I always thought his model was pretty simple. It's like, okay, in strategy, what game are you playing? How do you keep score? Then you're going to do prioritization. In prioritization, we typically use some sort of like ICE model, right? Impact, confidence, ease to help us prioritize. And then you're in execution. And then in execution, there's all sorts of things that go on, whether that's writing a PRD and so on and so forth. I think the execution and the prioritization stuff, I agree with Brian. I think it will lend itself quite well for AI. And in fact, if you look at the triad, like the designer, the engineer, and the product manager, and say, okay, who's furthest along in having AI subsume different jobs to be done? It's most definitely the engineers, right? And if you look at what's happening with the engineers, it's really the underbelly of their work. Like Copilot is like, hey, strategically, I laid out how I need to build out this program, but now I need to fill in all of the detail work on the function that I'm writing. And Copilot does a really nice job just auto-completing full like functions and classes and things like that. So I think in that scenario, it's like they're moving execution up to prioritization, and then they'll move up to strategy. So I think this is what you're saying, Brian. I kind of expected to go in that order as well.
There's also an interesting idea around AI that it's not going to be as helpful with the soft skills or the leadership skills. And there was an interesting study done about a year ago where they took questions from patients and they had doctors answer those questions, and then they had AI answer those questions. And then they had independent health experts rate the quality of the answers in terms of 2 different criteria. One is how clinically accurate was the answer, and then how empathetic was the answer. I know one of the things was the AI answers were 2x more accurate than the doctor's answers. Yeah. But really surprisingly, the AI answers were 7 times more empathetic than the doctor's answers.
Most people are bad at the people stuff. I've even used AI for that. It's like, hey, like I need to communicate this X message in this way. Can you help me with the language? And I've used it like I found that as one of the most helpful use cases by far.
Yeah, I do that all the time. I'll take an email, which I've just written up quickly. I know it's not, the language might be a little bit sharp, but it needs some softening up. Put it into ChatGPT thread and get an answer back that is usually much better. And, in this particular case, like doctors are constantly strapped for time. They're not going to spend a lot of time to get back to a patient. They're just going to send them the facts, versus AI has infinite time, infinite attention, infinite energy with which to be empathetic. And so as a result, you get more empathetic answers.
The other kind of oxymoron is people say, well, AI is biased. And I'm like, wait, I like humans are biased.
Yeah.
I think AI stands a much better chance of being unbiased than a human does. So Sure, I think there are biases in version 1 of the models that need to be sorted out, but in the long run, it's like, hey, if you're hiring someone, do you think you stand a chance, like in the long run, with AI being less biased than a human? I'm like, yeah. I remember that study that they did where the reason why there were so few women in symphonies is that they rehearsed and they showed if it was man or woman. And then they wound up, now when they pick symphony, they wind up closing a curtain and you don't see the person and you just hear the music. So you're like, okay, is that person a good violinist? And then once they started doing it that way, surprise, surprise, there was like far more women in symphonies than there were in the past. So,
yeah. I think what's the other piece that's interesting is you can actually be explicit about the bias that you want. Like Brian's example is like, sorry, Brian, I'm not being empathetic enough. Add more empathy, so you can like direct the bias, the communication. And I think that's actually pretty interesting. It's like, be more forceful, be less forceful. Humans are really hard to do that with. Like humans have inherent internal, biases towards how they speak, how they act, who they talk to, how many words they say, how fast they talk, etc. And the AI type tools are directable. So I think that's an interesting piece of this is like, you can tell them what bias you want them to have, subject to some rules and some, unoverridable things, of course. Let's not get too deep there. I think another piece that's interesting here is like, yeah, this has been like the big second theme, I think, of the podcast over the course of the last like few months has been, what is the impact of AI on the role of product management? And to connect the dots to the unstructured data piece is that a lot of things that were hard are easier now. Things like analyzing qualitative feedback. Think about something as simple as I have 480 different customer requests that have come in through customer support, and I need to know which ones are most common. This is a really hard problem to do unless you have trained your customer support team really, really well to cluster and tag like Flickr, right? Tags, every single thing that's come in, deduplicate the ones that are there, put some severity in terms of like how important it is, say which customers and how much revenue they have, et cetera. And every time we've tried to run one of these processes, we get something pretty fuzzy. And to your point, relatively biased. If somebody's really annoying about something, maybe that goes up your list, right? And that was a hard job, and now it's easier. But it's a new input, so there are ways in which it now makes the job harder, right? A thing you thought you could ignore, you can no longer ignore because it's like the number one request, right? Things that didn't have good impact on them, right? Where I was fuzzy guessing impact, now have like higher clarity impact. You can say this affects 150 customers over 50K ARR, which would be like a very difficult thing to do in the past. But actually, I think what the result will be is the number of things you think you should do because you have signal and all this unstructured data is actually bigger. So I think prioritization in some respects becomes harder because the known universe of possible, even like, let's ignore brand new features, like the universe of possible bug fixes, improvements, and changes that you think are important is probably larger because you have better data to connect the dots to our first theme around unstructured data. So that's the thing that I think is interesting is I think that the art of figuring out how to prioritize might actually be, it is harder to prioritize a 50 thing long list than it is to prioritize a 5 thing long list, right? And so that's one thing I worry about a little bit. It's sort of like in a cacophony of data, what do you analyze and what do you look at? Now we have like a new cacophony of data.
I'll say one more thing on this topic. As an investor, I really want to invest in a change in the software development lifecycle. And the vast majority of the things that I'm looking for assume that the software development lifecycle works the same way as it does today. Mm-hmm. So with AI, a lot of what I see is people saying, I'm going to plug in here and we're going to 2x the speed on this part of the loop. And one of the things that I saw when I was at Atlassian is that the average number of tools used in the software development lifecycle just on the engineering portion of the work was 25. And it's become way too much tooling and way too much specialization. And I've only seen one methodological change in the software development lifecycle, major change during the time that I've been product leader. And that was the change from waterfall to agile. And there's been, other things that were of note, like CI/CD and so on and so forth. But if you look at kind of like the big methodology change that kind of drove the last couple decades of the industry. So the thing that I want to invest in and the thing that I'm most interested in is like, what would happen if we just stepped all the way back, knowing what we know today, we have the marginal cost of reasoning going down to zero. Would you do it the way that we do it today? Or would you do something significantly different? And would you still have the same triad, which is the product leader, designer, engineer, or would that look differently? And I do think that there's going to be a big collapse of the talent stack. Like, I don't think you need a lot of specialization. I think we go back to more generalists. I think we go back to full stack engineers, full stack product managers, full stack designers, because the areas that you're weak at as a designer, product person, engineer, they get filled in by AI. But then again, I'm like, okay, do I still need the triangle or would I do something different? And that is what I'm most excited. I remember talking to Brian about this when I saw him last in person. I'm like, I really want to see this change. And I do think that it winds up being someone who's not too steeped in it. It's either like, my thesis was that, I was telling Brian, I'm like, you either need to know this stuff so darn well that you can restack and pack it in your head, or you need to be a recent college grad who's just super smart and you don't have any biases and you don't know what the current workflow looks like. And you come in and you look at it and you say, well, this is stupid. Like, why would we do all these things when we have this AI thing? We should just do it totally different.
Jeff, do you have any hypotheses on, obviously you don't have the new methodology in your head, but do you have like components that, or hypotheses around what you think is definitely going to be eliminated or definitely part of whatever the new methodology is?
Well, I have a hunch, and I have a hunch that it starts through engineering, because there are 10x the number of engineers as there are designers and product people. So when you look at a big methodology change, it's going to impact the most number of people on the engineering side. So I kind of feel like it should probably start there. I will say that the Devon stuff that people have seen, Cognition Labs, what I found really intriguing about it, first of all, they're relatively young. There's like an overabundance of like collegiate gold medalist engineers in there, something like, 10 of them. So you're like, oh, that seems like that's a good start. Maybe that team can figure it out. But one thing that what I found really interesting about it is the canvas changed. And I think that's really important. Like, if you have a methodological change, it's like, why would you try to cram everything into like VS Code and GitHub and Figma and the tools that we use today? Wouldn't you step back and say, hey, would we have a new canvas? So their canvas actually looks different. It has familiarity with things, but it's like, oh, I have a chat window and I have an IDE and I have a terminal and I have a browser, and it's all in one view. So I thought that aspect of it was really different. The second thing that I would expect would be a democratization of how you go about doing the thing. Because right now we're, depending on whose estimates you use, it's like 27 million to 40 million global software engineers in the world. And you're like, okay, well, we've got 1 billion knowledge workers. Let's say that we're just looking for the ones that are more left brain than right brain to do the engineering. That's still going to be a massive influx of people who could code. We're going to go from tens of millions to 500 million people who could code. So I would also expect to see something that would be like a conceptual model that would work for introducing 500 million people to the art of building something, where the coding language obviously would be built on English instead of something like C or Python or so on and so forth. So those are some of the characteristics I'd look for.
One of the things I'm already starting to see is elevated importance of design and designers in the product lifecycle. It used to be that a lot of things came together with the PRD, And then the design process was a matter of taking that and putting visual structure around it. And then that would go to the engineers. And increasingly what I'm seeing with teams, especially as dev mode and Figma gets more powerful, is that Figma is becoming the central place. It's where the source of truth lives around specs. It's where you start the process of generating the software. And it's also where the really hard decisions that AI, I don't think is going to be able to make anytime soon, happen. And those are decisions around how do all the pieces fit together? How do you lay this out in a way that people can really understand? Yes, you can do some, wireframe generation and design generation with Wizard and other things, but it doesn't really stand together really well, especially if you're building a more complicated product. And so that synthesizing thinking that designers are doing, I've already seen become more important over the last year, in part because of the work that Figma has done, but also in part because AI is helping on the left side of design with helping people build PRDs, and on the right side of design with helping people build software.
What I would expect to see, and what I've seen, at least in some of the work that you've done, Brian, at Reforge, and I've been close to in some of the startups that I'm working with, is like a return to prototype-driven development versus intermediary work product type development. I think what you're describing, Ravi, is it used to be like a design was a thing in Figma or a Photoshop file or an InDesign file, or whatever it is, that was an intermediary work product that then an engineer went and figured out how to turn it into code, right? And turn it into a finished product. But I think with a lot of the AI tools and also a lot of the developments that we've done in making product development more structured, things like component libraries and design languages and React and better coding tools, et cetera, is that I think a very product-minded person who knows how to build code can get you to a V1 of a product pretty solo relatively quickly. And I think the job of the product leader, and I'm not saying product manager for a reason, but the person who it holds the prioritization, the vision, the strategy of the product together, is going to be increasingly guiding V0s of things into releasable finished products. A lot like the way a film director or a showrunner leads turning a script into a finished product of a film. It's a little bit different, right? But that what we will be doing is iterating and building and growing prototypes more than we are turning documents into designs, into code, into release software, if that makes sense. The closer to full stack you are, and your willingness to work in any piece of the puzzle, and the better your product sense is, and I don't know how to evaluate that, but let's just say the better your product sense is of how to connect solutions to customer problems and identify the right customer problem, the more successful I think you'll be in this future. But if you feel like your job is take inputs and produce outputs, intermediary inputs and turn them into intermediary outputs, like that's at risk, I think. And so the triad is going to be blurrier and blurrier over time.
Is your expectation that more design leaders will become product leaders? Because I would say over my career, I've seen a lot of engineers transition into product managers. I haven't seen nearly as many designers transition into product managers.
I think they're going to stay designers. They're just going to do design work that is more and more strategic. And you already see this in certain companies where designers have some of the responsibilities that PMs had previously. So Airbnb is doing this.
Yeah.
Facebook does this on some teams. And so I think that's going to continue to evolve. And so I think for product folks, they're going to need to understand better how design works and how to translate the product vision into something that works in pixels. And then for designers, I think it's a matter of thinking more strategically and understanding how their design services customers' needs and helps add value to the business. I think it's probably easier for the designer to move in the strategic direction than for a lot of PMs to move in the design strategy direction.
I will say the most recent new pod we have in Reforge, we just transitioned to design lead to do both the product and the design work. And I have to say it's going quite well. Now there are specific attributes he has, which I think, made us think that it was possible. But yeah, it's definitely going very well.
The best designers that I've worked with are decent researchers. right? They're really good at doing customer interviews and identifying things. They're good prototypers. They are not just visual designers, right? Putting pixels on a page. They are building prototypes that you can actually interact with. Some of them code a little bit, not a ton, but a little bit. They are really good at identifying customer needs, doing prioritization, and have a little bit of a business sense. Maybe not like the world's strongest, but they care about the results, right? Like a great growth designer, for instance, knows what converts, thinks about what the results are, etc. So this is like what I mean by the full stack. T-shape's not good enough. You have to be sort of like pyramid shaped. Like you have to have pretty good skills around your core competency. Same goes for great engineers, right? Some of the best engineers I've worked with have a decent enough design sense to be able to whip together a bunch of components and build a good V1 prototype of a product, right? They care about the business and they ask questions around like what's going to drive real impact versus just the technical pieces. So again, I think the most full stack thinkers and builders in each discipline will end up leading products depending on the specific needs of those products over time. And ouch, that's scary. That does sound like product managers in the current realm of what they are probably are at the most risk unless they learn to build stuff.
I don't know about that because I think the product managers at risk today of being squeezed because both an engineer and a designer can actually have the skill sets that, you know, a great product leader has. And I think it's harder for the product leader, to Ravi's point, to become like there's an aesthetic sensibility that's hard to gain. And then on the engineering side, there's technical skills that you either kind of have an aptitude for or you don't. Imagine you could build a company of significance with a single person. Who in the current stack is most likely to be that single person? You know, is it going to come from the design ranks, the product ranks, or the engineering ranks? And when you phrase it that way, I would say, look, I think the product leader just generally has a broad understanding of the different tasks that need to come together. And they already are kind of full stacky. So I don't know if they get short squeezed. I actually am more bullish on it. Like I actually think leaders could do really well in the new world. Like I don't think they get bombed out of into insignificance. I think they have an opportunity to like stand up and be the solo person that creates $1 billion software company by themselves.
I agree, but let me disagree on one point. And I'm curious, Brian and Ravi, to hear your takes on this as well. I don't think that new product managers will come out of school or out of MBAs or those kinds of things and be trained to do product specifically. I think the future product leaders will be more likely to have started in one of these builder personas, right? Design, engineering, customer support, analytics, like a place where they gain the deep customer knowledge and ability to build on their own, and then grow into product leaders who I still think will be a real job out of their ability to full stack build things and be teams of one. That's, I think, my opinion. I don't know if that's actually going to be true, at least in larger companies. I think that'll probably be the thing. I think startups founder personalities are complicated and wide, but I do think it's like you have to have a penchant to build. You have to have the ability to turn it into results on your own without a large group of people. So I don't know. I think that's a half agreement.
Ravi, Brian, now we've got like a half agreement. We need some tiebreakers in here.
Well, I think the best product people have always been the ones who have been through the build cycle on something. They've been builders in some way, shape, or form. Not just building software products, but, you know, like
lemonade stands.
Lego sets, you know, train towns, all the things that I did as a kid. But I think even I've seen some transition from the marketing side that have been really good at building like their online presence. And they've been in the weeds of what it takes to take an idea from nothing and turn it into actual something, right? And so I don't know. I've always thought that was, you know, the best DNA for most product folks.
And my perspective on this is that product management is essential, but product managers are not. And so every successful company has to do product management. And if we think about product management as understanding what customers want, turning that into a working product, and then making sure that that product is accretive to the business, then that is something that no company can get away without. And depending on how the company works, depending on the personalities involved, you may need one or more dedicated product managers that are leading product management. But at other companies, product management is actually diffused throughout the organization. And I think that's what's happening at Airbnb. There's designers that are doing part of product management. There's engineers that are doing part of product management. There's marketing folks that are doing part of product management. So they're doing product management incredibly well, but not necessarily aggregating all of those responsibilities onto a single person. And I think what's happening with AI, just to build on what Fareed was saying, is the production work is getting less and less. And so the ratio of coordination that you need to do around product management is getting less and less. And so the things that you need to do to build a successful product are not as much, kind of the operationally intensive or production intensive things that a lot of PMs have been doing in the past, like writing PRDs and managing tickets and things of that sort. It really is coming down to the essential elements of strategy. Joff, you were talking about like there's this transition from waterfall to agile. And part of that transition was recognizing that in waterfall, you had to have specialists at every single stage. And so the handoff from one specialist to the next specialist was really important. And as a result, you had sort of an assembly line approach. And then I think what happened with agile is the walls around specialization started to fall down, and you could have teams that could scrum together and could work together and could understand each other's perspective, each kind of tackling different problems. I think that's going to continue to happen with AI, where you now can have a team of one who's able to work across all these other things, or you can have a team of 5, all of whom are athletes who can work on different parts of the problem at different times. And so I feel like that's part of the ingredients of what this next software lifecycle looks like, where it is a lot more integrated across all of these different activities, because the production work is not as specialized. And the work that really matters is the strategic work around figuring out where we're going and how to build that in a way that really works.
Yeah, I really like the way that you said that, because I think sometimes people listen in a podcast and they listen to these senior product leaders and they think to themselves, oh, they're trying to defend the product manager because that was their lifeblood. And it's like, absolutely not. There are roles inside of the software development cycle. One of them happens to be product leadership. Let's not use the word product manager. I've always been of the opinion that work can fall to different players. It could fall to design. It could fall to product manager. It could fall to an engineer. I just need clarity who's doing it, because when we're confused around who's doing it, we wind up having a mess, and I don't want to have a mess. Yeah. And I do think that it's much more fluid. So I like that you drew that distinction, Ravi. I think the other thing that you said that really stood out to me, and maybe this is my interpretation of it, is, in the software development lifecycle, if we go back to ground zero of when this thing got invented, it was probably Fred Brooks in the Mythical Man Month, the book that he wrote way back. I don't even remember the year that he wrote that. Maybe it was like early 70s or 60s or something. But he drew out this claim that the thing that is essentially the assembly line of the software development lifecycle is communication. And the more people that you add to a communication, the more combinatorial math that you have, the more people in the nodes that need to be kept up to speed. And that's actually what slows you down. So I think when you start to get to the simplification that AI, when it starts to collapse the talent stack, you have less of that communication that needs to get done. That usually a lot of that communication burden oftentimes had fallen to the product leader. So that kind of work goes away. So I think that was the other thing of what you were saying that I interpreted to be a significant change coming.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things I've been hearing a lot recently is this sort of pressure on understanding what are product managers, do companies need product managers? And a lot of companies are thinking about changing that role. And one of the, I think, failure modes is that the most product-centric companies in the world often have the lowest PM to engineering ratio, right? They have the fewest product managers because they're really product-centric and because other people in the organization are doing product work. And so there's few to none in terms of product managers within a very product-centric organization, with Apple and Airbnb being good examples. but also the least product-centric companies in the world look the same, right? There's very few product managers. And so it's important for companies not to fall into that trap of thinking that we can get rid of our product managers and we could still be product-centric. Because if you're not product-centric today, getting rid of your product managers is not going to make you more product-centric.
Thanks for listening to this mega 4-person episode of Unsolicited Feedback with Ravi Mehta, Joff Redfern, and Brian Balfour. This was part 1 of a 2-part episode. Part 2 will be dropping in just a few days. See you soon.